Hello, my name is Trevor Lee. Thank you for tuning in to this Evergreen webinar, which is called Presentation Flying Start. This was recorded live in February 2023, and in January and February 2023, I recorded 4 webinars altogether. This one, plus Win That Sales Pitch, Be That Confident Presenter, and 7 quick sales wins. So they're all available as evergreen webinars on my website, trevorjlee.com, and on my YouTube channel, Trevor Lee. So what did we cover in this one about Presentation Flying Start? Well, I covered 3 key areas in the 25 minutes. The pre-start, and then we move on to the things that you ought not to do when you start. And you might recognize some of those, or you've seen some of those in action. And then finally, how to deliver that flying start. Now, what I would say is take the bits that suit you, okay? And the core theme throughout this webinar is that it's got to be about your audience and not you. And that will be really emphasized in the how not to start your presentation. Now, before we get into that, I'm just going to share with you some of the things that I can offer you if you're looking for presentation help or training for you and your team. So the first program I offer is team training. And we can either do this in person over half a day or a full day, or we can do it virtually over 3 or 4 different sessions, whichever works best for your team. Depends where they're located in the world and how easy it is for them all to get together. But there's the contact, trevor@trevorjlee.com, or give me a call on that number if you want some team presentation training for your team. I also do one-to-one presentation coaching with business leaders. And this can be from anything from a 20-minute session up to maybe a 75-minute session. But it's usually if a key presentation is coming up or a key sales pitch is coming up and someone wants to make sure that they've got the very best chance of delivering it really well and successfully. And it means I can be a sounding board for you and, provide some observation. And it's really worth investing in just a few minutes of my time before you go live. But make sure you don't, book in the day before. Give it a week or ideally 2 weeks so we can really nail that presentation or pitch for you. And then you might need a specialist presentation skills session for your team. Could be something maybe on virtual presenting. Could be on confidence in presenting. It could just be a short, snappy session around a particular presentation technique that they want to do. So again, get in touch if you're interested. And what I would like to think we could do is I'll send you a link then, or you can find these links on my website, trevorjlee.com, which are 15-minute sessions with me. They're free, there's no obligation, so just click on the link and book those sessions, and then we can talk about your presentation needs, and I can steer you in the direction of the program that I offer that might be best for you. And lots of the programs I work on are designed bespokely around particular needs. And of course, don't forget my podcast, which comes out every Monday, the Better Presentations, More Sales podcast. As I'm recording this, 254 episodes, 5 years of podcasting, available on all the popular podcast apps. So it's a great way of staying in touch with what's going on in the presenting world, because I get some amazing guests coming on sharing presentation tips and sales tips, and hopefully the two combined together. Right, enough of all that. Let's go and walk our way through the webinar, which is called Flying Start Presentation. Thank you very much. So welcome everybody. This is Presentation Flying Start, as it says on the screen in front of you. And so what's going to happen over the next 25 minutes, I'm just going to share with you some thoughts and ideas how to get your presentation off to a flying start, or your pitch off to a flying start, because very often, this is one of the biggest challenges that people have when they're presenting, is that initial start, that sort of first minute or two almost. And that can make such a difference in terms of the way your audience react to you. So I'm going to share this session is going to be in 3 little chunks, really. So the first up is I'm going to talk about the things that you just make sure you've got right before, you actually start. So that, the time just before you start your presentation, because that will make a difference to how your presentation gets underway. And then I'm going to look at the things that you shouldn't be doing when you start a presentation. Okay, the things to avoid. Okay, and you'll recognize some of these because you'll have seen these. Hi, Phil. You'll have seen these as you go along. And then finally, of course, I'm going to show you some ideas how to start your presentation to give it that flying start. So just as a reminder, this is the fourth and the final at the moment in my mini series of 25-minute webinars. And we've done these three so far, the ones that you can see on the screen there. And they are now all available on my website, which is trevorjlee.com, rebrand in the last few weeks. And they look like this. And there's a button on there on the homepage, and it says watch the webinar. And that's what you can do. And I've taken out all the preamble at the beginning, and I've taken out any interaction and Q&A at the end. So you just get the core bit in the middle. So it comes in at about, I think there's a little introduction from me that I add on to the front of it. So it's still around about 25 minutes or just slightly under. So for those of you who's just joined us, a quick reminder that if you want to interact today, then please use the chat for anything that you want to share with each other. And just make sure it's clicked to everyone. And then if you want to ask a question, which I'll deal with either on the go or at the end, then please do fire that in there. And you can put that in, I think you can put that in anonymously, or you can just put it in for yourself. So why do we need that flying start, for our presentation? Well, I think these are the things that you want to achieve whenever you're presenting, and whoever that might be to. And that is that you need to engage your audience. You need to educate them. Far too many presentations go over stuff that we already know as a member of your audience. So think about the stuff in your presentation that people don't know, that they think, oh, that's a good idea, or something like that. And then, of course, you need to enthuse your audience, because at the end of the day, you're going to want them to take some action. That's why you're delivering the presentation or pitch in the first place. And to a degree, you want to entertain them. Now, I'm not going to be suggesting that you go juggling or fire eating or anything like that. But, it needs to be a bit of, it needs to be interesting. But today we're going to focus on, this first one, the engagement, because that is where you'll get, that's why you need your flying start to your presentation. And of course, that presentation could be various types. Here's just a few of the types of presentation that you could be doing. It could be a briefing to your colleagues at board level, or to your colleagues, within your organization. You might be pitching to win a new client or win new business from an existing client. You might have a new service that you're showcasing, or a product that you're doing a demo for. You might be looking for investment. And as it says on there, you could be sharing some research findings, or indeed you could be, part of an event, either a networking event or a big conference, either your own in-house conference or an industry conference or something like that. So everything I share with you today is relevant to all of these types of presentations. And it's also relevant to whether you're presenting as I am now online, or whether you're presenting in person. And I will show some differentiations between the two. So if you want to get your presentation off to a flying start, well, there are ways of doing that. You could just be going, right, come on, listen up, everybody, and get your megaphone out. But of course, that kind of like big, big ambitious start like that, just shouting at people to say, come on, listen to me, is not necessarily going to be the way to fully engage them. Because let's remember this, is that your audience are there, they're thinking, right, okay, give me a reason to listen to you. And that's from the very moment that you start to speak. In fact, before that, if you're in person, it's the moment when you walk into the position where you're going to speak from. They're already making a decision about whether what you're going to share is worth listening to, which is why you've really got to nail that first minute or two, and then they're with you. Otherwise, you're trying to do a presentation, your audience aren't engaged, and it kind of feels like you're going through the motions a little bit. So some of the things that we need to get over very early on are these: why I'm here, why you're here, what's in it for you, and what happens next. So for this particular session, why am I here? Well, I'm here because I want to share some ideas with you to help you become a better, starter of your presentations. And that's presumably why you're here as well. You want to pick up one or two ideas that you can take away and implement to give your presentations a flying start. And that's what's in it for you. The tips and ideas and advice that I'm going to share in this 25-minute short webinar. And then what happens next? Well, that's kind of down to you, isn't it? In this case, I'm not asking you to do anything with me necessarily, but what I'm asking you to do is to take one or two things and put them into the start of your next presentation. And if I would, if I can share one thing to take away with you, and every time I do anything on presentations, this is a key thing that I share all the time. And that is right from the get-go, think in this term, that it's about your audience. It's not about you. And that's so, so important. And when I've worked with other, people on presentations, this is a message I bang home all the time. And it's particularly important at the start, as you'll see when I share some examples with you. Because what you're trying to do is you're trying to make your presentation compelling, almost irresistible, ideally. So how are we going to do that? Well, before we work our way into that, I did say that I would just give you a few things to do and think about before you launch into your presentation. So here they are. So the things to do before you start. Number one is make sure you arrive early for your presentation. Okay, so I'm delivering this online. I opened it up 20 minutes before I was due to start. And the reason I did that is so I can get everything on the right screen, and then I can make sure that it's all checked and I can see that it all works. And that's really important. If you're arriving in person somewhere, then it's always a good idea to get there early and check the setup. And if you're doing a presentation at somebody else's premises, then I always say, try and find out what equipment you're going to be working with. But, I would always try and get an hour, to the venue an hour before if I'm working with a client or if I'm part of an event, just to give me plenty of time to, make sure. So if there's delays, that doesn't really make a difference to me. And if you're delivering this in person, you might want to check the seating, because that makes a big difference how you get your presentation going. I always move the seats around. Well, not always, but I'd say probably if I was to look at it, 50% of the presentations I've done in person, I've moved the seats slightly. And you can't really move the seats when everybody's sitting in them. So you've got to get there early. It means you've got enough room to be the presenter. Getting there early gives you a chance, if you're speaking in a bigger venue, to check how you're going to use your microphone. And don't forget, top tip, if you don't think you need a microphone, you probably do. I've got quite a loud voice, I'm told, but I always have a microphone if there's one handy. And the other thing to make sure that you get off to a good start is get someone to introduce you, because it'll feel a bit flat if you do your own introduction. And the top tip is take that introduction with you and give it to the person, or send it to them in advance, ideally. Don't rely on them making up the introduction about you, because they may say something which isn't relevant or it's not quite what you want to say. And then, you might laugh at this, but when you've done all that and you're ready to go, a few minutes before you start your presentation, either virtually or in person, just get a bit of fresh air, get a bit of a stretch, because you've got to be energized when you're delivering your presentation. You don't want to be slumped in your chair or, just wandering onto the event and thinking, right, I'm going to go and do my presentation, because that will rub off on your audience. And that will make a difference as well to the way they perceive you right from the get-go. So you need to arrive energized, ready to go. And then, of course, you have a little bit of time, hopefully, before you get into it, to meet and greet. And that's really important, particularly if you don't know anybody who's, in the company or the audience where you're speaking. And if you do know them, well, it's a chance to reconnect with them. And if you're feeling a bit nervous about doing your presentation, having a meet and greet, shaking a few hands will make a big, big difference to your confidence. You'll feel as though you've got friends in the audience, which you will have anyway, because they want to hear from you. That's why they're there. And if you're doing it virtually, then do as I did when Ellie arrived today. Just ask, someone who first arrives, can they hear you okay? Can they see you okay? Because that will make a difference as well. And then finally, in this sort of warm-up section, don't ditch the lanyards, the keys, the phones, anything that you might be carrying. They just get in the way. Okay, you can put them all back on later, but it's a thing. I often see presenters and they've got, like this lady in the picture here, they've got lanyard around their neck, and it just doesn't quite fit when you're actually doing the presentation. Right, let's move on then and talk about the things that, ideally you don't want to be doing when you start your presentation. So here are just a few of the things. So the first thing is the good old sound test. And you'll have all seen this, where it's someone's turn to speak and they get up there and they start tapping on the microphone. Can you hear me? Can you hear me okay? So don't do that at the start of your presentation. Get that out the way before you start. And if there's IT people there, then you can do a sound check if you need to, or if you're at an event, just trust that they've got it right. And if you're really worried about it, again, if you're there early, you can get them to check it with you. But don't do a sound test. Don't start your presentation telling jokes unless you are really good at telling jokes. And sometimes, again, it can be, well, for a pun, you're not really after a cheap laugh at the start of your presentation. There are far better ways you can engage your audience. And usually when people try and be funny at the beginning of their presentation, it doesn't work. And then the whole thing goes flat and your presentation, goes in the opposite direction to a flying start. Let's not have any rambling either at the start of our presentation. What we don't want is people standing up and say, oh, thanks very much, for inviting me here today. Oh, it's lovely weather, isn't it? And I've got the graveyard shift and I'm sure you can't wait for me to finish. Oh, people say that. Okay, now sometimes it's a bit of a nervous reaction, but they ramble around for the first minute or two and you're just going nowhere and you're losing time as well, because most presentations, as you know, you've got a fixed time to deliver them in. So let's get rid of the rambling. Oh, and please don't start with a slide that looks like this if you're doing a really, if you're after a great presentation, which looks like an agenda. And loads of people do it. And what do we think when we see something like this? We think agenda, we think meeting, we think going to run over, we think it's going to not be very interesting. Because let's face it, most meetings with an agenda aren't very interesting, or they run over on time, or both. And that's not the perception you want to create at the start of your presentation. Nor do you want to start your presentation by banging the drum. And what I mean by that is, banging the drum and saying, how great you are. Hey, look at all the trophies we've won. We're just brilliant. Oh, and our team, this is their weekly beach party. Aren't they amazing? And by the way, if you come to our premises, we've got this fantastic coffee machine. You'd be crazy not to work with us. Okay, so, if you start with that drum banging, it's all about you. And let's remember, your audience at the beginning of your presentation probably aren't interested in you or your company at all. What they're interested in is your product or service and what it will do for them. So it's all about them. It's not about you. If you want to talk about your great coffee machine or the awards you've won, then fine, but don't put it in at the beginning. Sneak it in somewhere in the middle or towards the end, or just in a casual comment as you go. Far too many people start their presentation talking about themselves and wonder why their audience switches off pretty damn quickly. Because chances are I know all about you anyway. Because, that's why I'm coming to your event, or that's why I've invited you to do a presentation to me. You don't have to keep telling me about you. It's a big point, makes a big difference. And also don't start and turn up, with this, with a load of big notes, okay, as in the photo, as in the image here. Because all that says to me is A, you don't know what you're talking about, so you need all the notes, or B, you haven't bothered to practice this, and therefore, you're hoping I'll be there, but you haven't put the time and effort in, therefore you need all the big notes to remember where you're at. So don't turn up with big notes. It sends out the wrong message, and it doesn't go down very well when you start your presentation. Right, so how should we start our presentation? Well, of course, it's a very personal thing, this, and you're going to have to adapt to what works for you. So I'm just going to share with you some tips and ideas and advice that I've picked up over the years, delivering presentations, coaching people, and watching others and listening to others talking about presenting. So first up, don't go too fast at the start. Okay, particularly if you're delivering virtually, because one of the challenges will be for people to keep up with you. This is a guy called Dr. Alan Carroll, some sort of business psychologist, came on my podcast a few weeks ago, and he said, start your presentation in first gear and then move up towards fourth gear. Don't start in fourth gear. And it's an important point because your audience, whether they're virtual or in person, they need to latch onto your pace. And once you've been talking for a minute or two, you can start to build the pace if you wish, because then they'll go with you. And the other thing at the beginning is to remember how important your voice is. Because what you don't want to do is deliver the start of your presentation in a monotone voice all the way through. Otherwise, within a minute, people will start to switch off. And this is something you need to practice. If you're not confident about using your voice, but it's about projection. It's not about shouting. And we can use our voice to go slowly, to emphasize a word, and we can use it to pause, which is really effectual. Right. Another top tip for you when you start your presentation is this. This is a guy called Brian Burkhart. He's from the States. He's a presentation coach, and he happened to be the first States guest on my podcast, I think. And he's got this thing called the 75-second rule. And this applies if you're using slides, which I imagine most of you do. And what Brian says is just simply keep your first slide on the screen for 75 seconds. Why do that? Well, it means that you can get that engagement with your audience going. Because if you're not going to change the slide for 75 seconds, then this is what happens. You have eye contact with the audience. You don't start looking and reading and talking to the screen because it's not changing. So it gives everybody a chance to get used to it. And in that 75 seconds, you can then outline something that's going to engage your audience. And what could that be? Well, it could be some of these. You could start with that first slide up there with a short story or anecdote, something that's relevant. And when I say short, I do mean short, so a minute or so. The trouble is with presenters that they think short means 5 minutes or 10 minutes. They just go on and on and on. And they think it's short. The audience think, is this ever going to end? Okay. So make it short, make it relevant, but use it to capture the attention of your audience. You could also start maybe with a stat, something, that's happening in the world that's relevant to your audience at the time. And a stat is a really powerful thing. I did some work, when was it, 2 or 3 years ago, with a school for social entrepreneurs. And they had all their entrepreneurs ready to do a big pitch type presentation. And I helped them with the start of their presentation. And one of the entrepreneurs, she started with these words. These were the first words that she spoke at the start of her presentation. And her social enterprise was all about curing this problem, about getting kids eating before they went to school. It was a very powerful way to start. So if you've got a powerful stat, think about using that. If you haven't, maybe you could use a headline statement. Here's one that I've used in the past when I was talking about, retaining customers. I'm not going to read it out, but you can see for yourself what it looks like. You could start with a prop to get people's attention. Here's me in action a few years ago, using a wetsuit and a t-shirt to make a point, to get a presentation off to that flying start. You might also want to, if you're thinking about how to interact with your audience and get them engaged online, then, you might want to run a poll. So I think what I'm saying here is that, there are several ways of starting that first minute or two, which will get you off to that kind of flying start. And the other thing about it is if you're feeling a bit nervous about presenting, if you start with something you're familiar with, like that story, like that stat, like that headline statement, it will settle you into the presentation. And you won't have to worry about thinking, what am I going to say at the start? What if I miss something out? What if it goes wrong? Because you know that story, the story behind that stat, that headline. And then, of course, you want to then explain why what's coming up is going to be useful to your audience. And that's where you then probably go back into something like this. So you've done your story, you've done your stat, and then you move on and you explain what's coming up. And one of the things about great presentations and pitches is keeping your audience informed about what's going to happen. As I explained at the beginning of this, we're going to be in 3 sections. I'm going to give you some warm-up things, some not to do things, and then the to do things. And we're now in the to do things as we head towards the end of our 25 minutes. And then, of course, the other thing to think about at your start as part of your information is if, like as I'm doing here, if there is a Q&A, then make sure you explain to people how that's going to work as well. So essentially, you're telling everybody what's going on, why they should be interested, and if you want them to do something specific at the end, then tell them that at the beginning. So at the end of my presentation, I'm hoping I will have convinced you to have a meeting with me or something like that. Or you want another demo, or you want to, you want to take this further, whatever it might be. But sow the seed in the mind of the audience about what you want them to do at the end, at the beginning, in that presentation flying start bit. And if you want a summary of, how you might introduce your presentation, then here's an example of something that I've used in the past as well. where, I'm reminding the audience, how much time I've got, 15 minutes. What I'm going to share, 3 ideas that will help them, in this case, attract new customers. So it's all laid out there in one basic sentence, why they should want to engage with me and keep that engagement going throughout. I've set a series of promises down that I'm going to deliver, and that will help me get their engagement and therefore get my presentation off to that flying start rather than muddling along. Because at the end of the day, all your presentation is going to be accumulating into audience action. What do you want the outcome of your presentation to be is the key question to ask yourself. So there we go. And people say to me, well, how much time should you spend on the start of your presentation, Trevor? Well, this is the graph that I use in terms of structure when I'm working with people on planning their presentation. And as you can see, I normally allocate around about 15% of the time to the start. So if you're doing a 10-minute presentation, that's only 90 seconds before you move on to your key or core messages. So it's not even 15% is not long unless you're presenting for about an hour or something like that. Okay. But, when you practice, do that. Make sure that you practice the start of your presentation and how long it's going to take. And then, of course, your next question is, well, what about practice? How should I practice the start of my presentation is what people ask me. And I say, well, if you're going to practice anything in that presentation start, maybe it should be, the first bit. And that might just be the first 30 seconds. And of course, it's very easy to practice it when you're delivering it virtually because you can do it before everybody turns up. When you get to the venue, that's another good reason for arriving early. And if I arrive at the venue early, I get my slides in position, I get everything set up, and then I will probably, go through my first 30 seconds. So there we go, ladies and gentlemen. That's coming towards the end of my 25 minutes. So in a second or two, there'll be a chance to ask any questions that you want if you put them in the Q&A, and then I will endeavor to answer them for you. But just to remind you, so we want to engage our audience. We want to educate them. We want to enthuse them, and to a degree, we want to entertain them. And all of those things, people, your audience will be making their minds up in the start of your presentation as to whether that's what they're going to get from it. And that's why having a presentation flying start, which is particularly, get their notice, is really important, which is why, talk about them or their industry or their problems, not about you. And finally, another E is this one. And that is, make sure you go out there and enjoy delivering your presentation and try and come across from the get-go as enjoying it, because that is infectious into your audience. And if you make it very clear in the first minute or two that you're enjoying delivering the presentation, then your audience will be swept along by that, and they will want to enjoy it along with you. So there we go. I hope that's been useful, everybody. That is that's the kind of the presentation stuff I wanted to share with you today. So I hope that will then get you thinking about how you deliver the start of your presentation next time you've got a presentation or a pitch to deliver, whoever that might be to. Now, if you want some further tips and advice, then I can point you in the direction. I've mentioned my podcast a couple of times. It's the Better Presentations, More Sales podcast. It's available on all the podcast apps. And well, this week, in fact, yesterday, Monday, it was the 5th anniversary of the podcast. So most podcasts only get as far as 7 episodes, and we're up to 254. So not bad. And the great thing about the podcast is that I somehow, I don't know how it happens, but I get loads of global guests, mainly from the States, who want to come on and share their stuff. And I'm getting a bit to the stage where I'm getting inundated with agents who want to put their podcast guests on my show. So it all feels a bit surreal at times, but it is available on the podcast app. Now, if you've enjoyed it today, then you can do what Kate kindly did last time, and that is go online and go on LinkedIn or somewhere and mention it in LinkedIn, that you've got something from today. That'd be great. Or if you want to make a direct contribution, then you can always buy a copy of my book. I've got a presentation book coming out very soon, but that's not available yet. And the 12 business lessons from running an ultra marathon. I get £5 for each sale, all of which goes to the Children's Hospice Southwest. So you can find it on Amazon. And don't forget, you can find all these webinars on my website, trevorjlee.com. And on the website, you'll also find out the services I offer. So if you need further help with your presentations, it might be a team training, half day or whatever, either online or in person. It could be some one-to-one coaching on a particular part of your presenting activity, which could be as little as 30 minutes, or we could do a specialist session for you and your colleagues. And if you want to get in touch, then there is my email.